We're out of stakes, out of nails, out of coffins and shovels. We've got vampires to hunt, but we're out of supplies. And alcohol. We've got to see her.
The witch.
Throughout the ages, many cultures were forced to deal with the presence of the blood-hungry monsters. They were known under various names: vampir, lugat, vrikolakas, upir or wąpierz, and though they shared many similarities, they were not the same. They varied from mindless wandering corpses to cunning creatures with the ability to transform into the shape of wolves and bats. Sometimes vampiric creatures were described as ghosts, and sometimes they were more akin to werewolves. In short, there is no single definition of a vampire that would fit every belief. Vampires we know today from contemporary movies, games, books, and comics were created by the writers of the 18th and 19th century, who romanticized the image of both monster and the monster slayer. Because of that, when people think about vampire hunting, they think of something like this. Of course, all this exciting action is excellent entertainment. Movies and television, however, do not capture the real thrill of hunting the vampires, which does not involve so much skin-tight latex and attractive ladies. It's more like... this. I think he's had enough. Let's go. In most cases, vampires, or rather creatures that we would describe as vampires today, were created when the dead person decided that lying in the grave wasn't very fun. Cultures who feared the vampires believed that a perfect soul and an unclean body are two different entities, and in the moment of death they become separated. This dualism between pure spirit and evil flesh was a mainstay of this fancy word, this fancy word, this fancy word, Christianity and many sects like this fancy word and Cathars. But sometimes the soul lingered behind and would inhabit the dead body, especially when it belonged to the murderer, criminal, or a ginger. The vampires and revenants were created from people that were feared during their lifetime. Sometimes for the right reasons, like murderers, convicts, kidnappers, thieves, and criminals of different sort. But there is a darker side to those beliefs. Everyone who didn't fit into that norm of the era was considered suspicious at best. If you were left-handed, or you were suffering from any kind of mental illness or body deformation, you could be considered a future vampire. Even a protruding tooth could be the reason why your grave would receive some extra attention. Just like in the case of a Polish woman found near city of Bydgoszcz on 30th August of 2022. Everyone who was different in any way could be accused of being a vampire. Heterochromia, hormonal disorders, uneven menstruation, red hair, or even gossip could create a notion that a person will rise from his or her grave to wreak havoc. But it must be said that if somebody is constantly talking behind your back, turning into a bloodthirsty undead creature to get revenge is a completely reasonable cause of action. The vampires could also be created from corpses of those who died violently. Drowning, suicide, plague, or wicked life were sufficient reason for the living to fear the dead. Marginalized social groups, women practicing witchcraft, children that died unbaptized or were born out of wedlock, and outsiders were all treated with suspicion, alive and after death. Contrary to the popular media, hunting the vampire wasn't about dueling with sword and stake with a charismatic and undeniably sexy vampire daddy. Dealing with the bloodthirsty undead in real world was much less spectacular. It wasn't a deadly expedition to the crypts filled to the brim with monsters that would pop up from the coffins in the most dramatic fashion. Sealing the potential vampire in its grave was conducted during its funeral by placing certain objects in the coffin or tomb and, well, that was it. No final fight, no last moment rescue, no choir and intense music in the background. Most of the known vampires cases were recorded in villages and small towns. So, instead of mysterious warriors, members of the secret order created to battle the undead, you would see a priest and a group of farmers armed with shovels, hammers, sharpened poles, sickles and nails. The most popular way of dealing with the vampires was, of course, a shovel, used as a means to bury the dead and to cut the head of the corpse. Driving a stake into the corpse and separating it from the body were the most popular ways to stop the vampire from rising from its grave. The monster couldn't leave the burial site without the head, and reaching for the skull that was placed at the feet was impossible, and thus the creature remained still. We talked about this way of dealing with the undead during our previous videos, which can be found here. You might think that it is quite underwhelming that the most widespread tool of hunting vampires was a simple shovel and a piece of sharpened wood or an iron nail. The truth is that our perception of vampire hunters is warped by media beyond any recognition. In fact, it was the books, comics, games and movies that created and expanded the archetype of a vampire hunter we know today, but sadly, it doesn't have any significant connection to the real world. There were no witches or secret societies dedicated solely to fighting the supernatural. If you like the vision of Helsing organization or Silver Saints from the novel Empire of the Vampire by J. Christoph, you will be disappointed by the fact that vampire hunters are almost non-existent in historic sources. Of course, myths and legends are full of blood-hungry monsters, but the people who fought with them weren't full-time monster hunters who did nothing in their spare time but exterminate beasts of various shapes while chugging on the morning coffee laced with vodka. Slaying a dragon, vampire, minotaur, or other terrifying creature was a part of the bigger journey, a stage of a quest given by the king, god, or destiny itself. In reality, it was the everyday people who dealt with the vampires. The struggle against the supernatural threat was, well, something common for the people of the bygone eras. Ghosts, wraiths, vampires and werewolves were as real as trees and animals people encountered every day. And since the most cases we know about are recorded in the villages, the tools of those hunters were as ordinary as the people who held them. Shovel, hammer, axe and sickle were tools of the farmers who couldn't afford something like a repeating crossbow, shooting stakes, holy relics, silver swords or vials of flammable liquids. Well, disappointing, I know. In most cases, the people would take care of unruly undead themselves. Often it was the gravedigger or the executioner who opened the grave and neutralized the vampire. Both of these occupations played an interesting role in medieval societies, especially the executioner, who was very well paid for his duties, but was also treated as the social outcast. Executioners lived in the side alleys of the cities and on the outskirts of the villages. The taverns sometimes had a special cell where the headsman could drink in solitude without interacting with other patrons. The grim reputation made executioners very well compensated pariahs, who placed a mark of social stigma on themselves and their children as well. Because of that, the executioners didn't have much of a choice while looking for a wife, and headsman families often intermarried with themselves. The mantle of the executioner was then passed from father to son, and the head-cutting circle started anew. Executioners were always shrouded in mystery, which stemmed from the fact that they were living on the fringes of medieval society. They were fairly rich, and they played an important role not just during executions, that weren't as common as you probably might think. Executioners also dealt with taxing the lepers, prostitutes, gaming houses, and were taking care of animal carcasses, latrines and cesspools. Basically, the executioner was a man responsible for enforcing the dirty side of the law. Mind you, like a politician, but much more just. Because executioners' families formed their own little society, they were surrounded with many stories that exaggerated quite normal aspects of a headsman's job. For example, the knowledge about herbs, or dealing with the parts of the convict's body, which were considered powerful magic ingredients. It's a common thing that people spread tall tales about something or someone that is mysterious, and executioners were mysterious indeed. That said, there were at least two types of people you should seek if you are dealing with the vampire, apart from me, of course. One of them is a dampir, a half-vampire which we will discuss in the future. And the other is a witch.
Hello, Florence. And you?
The witches enjoyed a peculiar reputation throughout the ages. Much like executioners, they were both revered and detested. Their knowledge about herbs and healing different ailments was sometimes the only help the villagers could get in terms of medical care. The women later prosecuted for witchcraft were responsible for protecting livestock from predators with charms, predicting future, and preparing potions which varied from love elixirs to extremely potent poisons. I should mention that you should avoid angering a witch if you want to not get cursed. Plants play an important role in fighting the vampires, thus herbalism is one of the most crucial pieces of knowledge a monster hunter can possess. That and kung fu with a shovel. The most famous plant used against the vampires is, of course, garlic is rightfully considered the most useful plant used to ward off vampires and evil spirits. In Balkan region, the leaves of garlic were hung near the doorpost to guard the entrance to the household. But why is garlic so powerful? Vampires, like many creatures that crawled up from their graves, were linked to the presence of illness and pestilence, and anything that provided any means of defense was treated with proper respect. Garlic is in fact very nutritious, boosts the immune system, has antibiotic properties and many other health benefits. It's no surprise that such a plant that helped to keep people in good health was treated as a mean to scare away the vampires and keep evil forces in check. The leaves of garlic were hung near the doors, placed under the pillow, worn around the neck or waist. Other popular herb used against the vampires is, not coincidentally, another cornerstone of Mediterranean cuisine: basil. Those aromatic leaves were placed alongside newborn babies to shield them from harmful spells and ghosts, i.e. the sickness. Just like garlic, basil was hung in homes, around wells, put on the tables, and people were carrying twigs during everyday chores. And just like garlic, basil is also known for its beneficial impact on health. Rosemary, myrtle, sage, and other aromatic herbs were also regarded highly as a proven way to keep both vampires and the doctor away. Another way of pacifying the vampire involved poppy seeds. If you scatter them in the grave, the vampire will be forced to count them before leaving the grave. A similar method can be seen in stories involving cheating the devil, by giving him an extremely difficult task that will keep the demon occupied until dawn. A rather famous variant of this method can be found in the grim version of a fairy tale about Cinderella. Her cruel stepmother threw a bowl of lentils into ash and forced Cinderella to pick up seeds in an extremely short amount of time. Another way of keeping the dead sleeping peacefully in their graves included placing a sickle on the throat of the corpse. If a vampire would try to get up, the blade would slice the throat open. A rope is another handy piece of equipment that was used to bind the suspected vampire. Sometimes a cord wasn't enough, and an iron padlock was placed on the vampire's foot. Not only was iron commonly used as a mean of protection against forces of evil, but a padlock symbolically locked the vampire in its grave. The magic, just like the real world, is ruled by certain laws that even the undead cannot break. If there is a padlock in the grave, the vampire must open it in order to get away. Conversely, if you place a key in the grave, the vampire won't leave until it finds a matching keyhole. If you have some spare coins, place them in a grave, or even better, under the tongue of the dead. That way the vampire will have something to bite on instead of the flesh of the living. If you are out of money, a stone or a brick will do the job. Place it on the throat to block the jaw, or jam it straight into the mouth to ensure safety during the hunt. An example of such an action could be seen in the case of the famous vampire of Venice. She was most likely a victim of the plague and under suspicion of being a witch, but the methods used against that woman were also employed against the vampires. If you want to be extra sure that the vampire won't rise again, you need to get dirty. Or rather, your henchman needs to get dirty. Grab a knife and cut the Achilles tendons, or use a red-hot skewer and stick it into the corpse. Naturally, the stake is a tried and tested method of dealing with the vampires, which we talked about earlier. According to Serbian folklore, one of the best kinds of wood to craft a stake is hawthorn, a potent weapon against vampires, ghosts and witches. If you don't want to leave anything to chance, you could always burn the body of the vampire and scatter the ashes in the wind. Fire was often associated with cleansing and change, which makes it an important part during the rites of passage, death being one of them. If you don't want to play with fire, you can just go with the flow and throw the remains of the vampire into the river. The notion that vampires cannot cross running water is in fact connected in a fascinating way with the garlic and wooden stakes. A hawthorn tree was believed to be a house of the spirits that could send down an illness. To prevent that, you had to appease the demon with certain incantations and rituals before you cut the tree down. Because of that, hawthorn wood retained some of the spirit's magic and could be used as a charm, protecting you from sickness. People of Serbia were using hawthorn wood to craft charms worn around the neck, placed near beds and cribs, or sometimes sewn into the clothing. A hawthorn stake wasn't used just for killing vampires. During the plague, it was placed in front of the house to protect its residents from succumbing to the disease. After sticking it into the ground, the whole family recited an incantation that could be roughly translated as "Plague, come to the stake, but no further." It was the reason why vampires, the disease-transmitting monsters, were weak to the stakes made from hawthorn. Same rules applied to the garlic and other healthy herbs. To keep it short, things that cured people or were seen as an effective way of preventing disease were also useful against vampires. But what about the flowing water? The rivers drew natural boundaries, and sending a vampire on a one-way trip to the sea was a good way to confuse the undead and ensure that he would not return. But that's not everything. Flowing water was commonly associated with clean, pure water that was safe to drink. Even though it is said that the swift mountain stream is the best place to quench your thirst during a trip, you really shouldn't do that unless you really like spending time at the Temple of Contemplation. But for the people who weren't aware of the presence of bacteria, protozoa or amoebae, clear water was a symbol of purity. While swamps, oxbow lakes and other bodies of standing water were associated with the presence of looming disease. In brief, rivers represented purity, health and fertility, while vampires were polar opposite of that. Barren, wretched, plague-ridden creatures. Throwing vampire remains into flowing water was effectively sealing the monster in a prison without the slightest chance of escape. But if you want to get fancy with killing a vampire, you can use the Bulgarian bottle method. Oh yeah! With religious talismans and charms, you can force a vampire to enter a bottle that will be sealed with a special effigy cork. Having trapped the creature, you can mess with it, or throw it into the fire to purge it from existence once and for all. The Bulgarian bottle method is one of the fanciest ways to deal with the vampires that is also tied to the notion that vampires can poison air and spread illness that way. Some people also state that the iron cages placed upon the graves were used to prevent vampires from rising up. However, a morgue safe, or morgue cage, wasn't connected to the undead in any way. It was a construction designed to protect fresh graves from robbers that supplied medical schools with bodies that could be used to learn anatomy. I hope you enjoyed our time spent together, and I'll see you next time. Happy hunting!